This is a difficult subject for sure. I'm 54 years old. I'm an only child. And over the past 10 years, I have helped my parents navigate through a lot of levels of care, and up to and including the passing of my father. The trouble is that when I was going through these things with my dad, I would ask people about, how do you navigate these things? What do you do? And most people would say, I didn't live in the same town as my parents, or, I had a brother or a sister who lived in town with them and they took care of it. All of these sorts of things, which is no judgment on anybody, but it wasn't helpful to me in that moment because there's things that come up and you got to deal with them. I reached out to the people that I knew that I could, but not many of them really had any experience that was helpful to me. This video is kind of about that process, what my experience was. Again, I have a level of privilege that others may not, a lot of factors that may make this less helpful to you than to others. I'm sharing this in the hope that it does help somebody navigate this process, because I had no clue. Really brief kind of synopsis. My dad had vascular degeneration, which led to some Parkinson's-like symptoms. He'd had that condition for a while, and kind of rapidly over the course of a year, it sort of accelerated, and he was hospitalized more than a few times, usually for like dehydration and things like that. Experienced really a period of rapid decline where he went into a skilled care facility, and then into that was in a rehab place, into a long-term skilled care facility, and then hospice, and he passed away. And this was literally like about a 3 or 4 month span of time. Interestingly enough, my mother, who had dealt with some of these things with my grandparents, just had kind of checked out. Like, she just sort of was in an emotional place, which is completely understandable, where she couldn't deal with any of it. And she had problems of her own that were starting to crop up at that time. And so I was forced to just make those decisions. And it's difficult because I had little or no knowledge of things like powers of attorney, all these sorts of things to be able to make these decisions. My best resource at that time was to use some nurses that I knew, who were very helpful and provided me with a lot of information and things to do. Also, the medical social workers were also really helpful to me when my dad was in the hospital. The first place that I would start with this is that over the last 10 years, I've been working with these folks to move my parents out of their home into an independent living situation, then into just my mom after my dad passed, a assisted living place, and then now into a memory care unit. All of those things, like if you'd asked me 10 years ago, what does that mean? I had zero idea. Learning about that and educating oneself is really critical. Past generations, a tendency to view doctors as the ultimate authorities. And so doctors would say this, and that's what they would do, or at least pretend like they were going to do that. Many times people, wouldn't follow through on those things. And I've seen this in my own parents. Many people age, they get forgetful, they just don't care about that kind of thing. And so they'll say, yes, I'm going to do that, and they don't. And oftentimes, too, doctors will rattle off a whole bunch of things, and you'll have no idea what they mean. And nobody will stop them and say, because they seem like really authoritative, busy people, nobody will stop them and say, what does that mean? And that is the first step in being able to advocate for, your loved ones that are in these kind of situations, is to stop them and say, what does this mean? That's really important. If they can't really express that to you in a way, keep pushing, keep asking the question. And my experience is that usually doctors are not the best resource. The nurses and the medical social workers can translate what the doctors are saying into human. And so then you can use that information to help you make the right decision. That navigating the healthcare system oftentimes comes down to that kind of steady communication. And in my experience, and trust me, I've done everything wrong that you could. And so this is just a reflection of what my experiences have been and what the best practices that emerged for me from that were. The best thing you can do is to treat doctors like mechanics. They're there to fix the broken car, in this case, a human. They really don't think about it after that. They have a lot on their plates, lots going on. They're pushing people through these systems, and they really don't have time to interact with people that much. There are some rare exceptions, but that's the major experience that I've had. Those medical social workers, usually they'll come in, like if your loved one is hospitalized, they'll come in towards when they're getting ready to be discharged and talk to you about some options. Talk to them, because they will talk to you, in my experience, and they will help you understand things. For instance, one of the things that both my parents have had hospitalizations and surgeries and all of this kind of thing over the last 10 or 12 years. One of the things that they'll come in and say is, would you like, your mother or father go to a rehab facility after they get discharged, which is usually as quickly as they can get you out the door, 2 or 3 days. If it's longer than that, then, that's a different matter. But they'll come and say this, would you like your relative to go to a rehab facility? Understanding what that means is, again, you can ask them, what do you mean by that? Where does that work? How do I get that done? In my state, for the circumstances that my folks were in, they can go to a rehab facility after they've had a surgery or some kind of incident where they required hospitalization for at least 15 and up to 30 days. And that really helps them in many ways to recover from whatever incident or surgery that they had. Really important to know that. And also, another really important thing to consider is that Medicare pays for that. So there are no, other than incidentals, there's no costs associated with them, provided they have insurance. There's no cost associated with them going to this rehab facility. Super important to check into that with that medical social worker. Often I've found that nurses talk to nurse case managers, who talk to doctors, who talk to each other, and medical social workers talk to nurses and sometimes nurse case manager, but sometimes those 3 layers don't talk. Being aware of that and sorting through that, you have to be the advocate, you have to be the communicator in this situation, and asking them to check in with other people there. 2 real quick examples. My mother had been hospitalized for having an abscess in her mouth at one point, had surgery in one hospital. They determined that they needed to move her to a different hospital because they weren't quite up to speed with what they needed to do. So they moved her to a more advanced hospital, and those people were like, well, we're gonna have her have this surgery again. A doctor called me in the morning before she was gonna have the surgery again and started walking me through it. I suddenly realized that he didn't know that she had had the surgery like 3 or 4 days earlier, and this was a redo. And so I said, are you aware of this? And he was like, no, you should look at the case file. And I really tried to deliver it just like that because the worst thing you can do is challenging people is fine. In my experience, that tone matters. And if you want people to do what you want them to do, then you have to smooth it out a little bit. Another example was one time she was in the hospital and went to go see her and noticed that she had a patch on. And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, she's has a nicotine patch on." And I said, "Is that part of her treatment?" And they said, "No, it just indicated in her chart that she needed a nicotine patch." My mother hasn't smoked in her whole life. And so somebody had made some kind of assumption that she was a current smoker and needed this nicotine patch. Well, obviously that's not the case. Another aspect of this navigating is medications. My parents became more, I mean, and this is understandable. Cognitive function declines some, and they're also sick. They don't understand necessarily what medications they're taking. They may be seeing 2 or 3 or 4 different doctors, and those doctors don't necessarily talk to each other. They can prescribe things that are counterindicated with other stuff, and you have to kind of be aware of that. Whenever I would have my mom go to the hospital for whatever reason, or my dad, I would get a list of the medications that they were taking. And then when they were in independent living, I'd have to kind of like check and see, do you have all the things you need? And they would be, due to this cognitive decline, other things that happen, they can be angry about that. Yes, I can take care of myself kind of attitude. Sorting through that stuff can be difficult. It depends on your relationship with your parents, but I was able to sort through that and figure out that, they're taking stuff that they shouldn't take. But I couldn't do anything about it in many cases because I'm the child. They're capable of, in the eyes of the state, in managing their own affairs. And so sometimes there's just not much you can do about it other than, try to talk through that with them. That brings up that power of attorney thing, and get them really critical for healthcare and finances, especially because let's say that your loved one is incapacitated and you don't have power of attorney for healthcare. You can make no decisions, and they can honestly not tell you a whole lot about what's going on. Like, for instance, what medications is my parent on would not be accessible to you unless you have that healthcare power of attorney for when they're incapacitated. That can also be extended in some cases, like with my mother, I've had to take that on completely. So I have a power of attorney for healthcare under any circumstances, not just when she's hospitalized or unconscious. So, and that takes a process and takes having an attorney who knows to do that and those kinds of things. Anyway, having those things and the finance part, because again, people who are sick, people who are not well, people who are in cognitive decline for periods of time, they don't pay attention to paying the bills. They don't do that stuff. Sorting out that, being able to access their accounts and pay the things that need to be paid and to set it up. My parents had this bewildering system and they paid everything by checks and, all of this kind of stuff. And it was a huge mess. And many times when they were doing particularly poorly, they would really kind of lose track of things and not understand if they had money or not. And so being able to sort through that and be able to make that call to the bank or make that call to the credit card company or whoever it is and sort out like, okay, I need to get this paid. What are we going to do? Is important. Powers of attorney for healthcare and finances and I would recommend, my parents had limited powers of attorney with me listed on there pretty early on, but they were only when they were incapacitated, if they're in the hospital or something like that. And so then they would get out, get better, and then I would have no ability to do anything. Sorry, that's my dog. At least they had that. And so that allowed me to take that next step when the time was right, not for my dad, but for my mom, and to be able to take those powers of attorney to the next level. Back one real quick note about that 3 or 4 or 5 doctors thing. Find a gerontologist and ask a nurse, like, hey, do you know any gerontologists and who's good? Ask them. That's what I did, and I found a person who was great because the gerontologist can unify all of that stuff in one place and be the kind of repository for information. So if the gerontologist says, we're going to give her these medications, that's what's going to happen, not this bewildering mess of things. And also, the gerontologist makes the referrals to the specialists. Like, my mom sees a couple of different eye doctors, and I won't go into the details, but she sees a couple of different eye doctors, and those are appointments are 3, 4, 5 times a year. Uh, that kind of control of and centralization of information really helps, because then I can ask the gerontologist about something and the gerontologist will know. And I don't have to sort through, which doctor is this and what do they do? And one of the first things I did when I had that full healthcare power of attorney was to move my mother to this gerontologist, go see the gerontologist and have a private discussion with her about what the situation was. And then also to say, here's the meds my mom is on. What does she need to be on and what doesn't she need to be on? And so she worked through this with me and showed me everything and took the time to do that. And a good gerontologist will do that. And so super important. Once you have those powers of attorney kind of in place, the next step is to be able to think about what is independent living, what is assisted living, what is skill care, what's memory care, what's hospice. Independent living is essentially an apartment in a community of some mostly older people, and they just kind of keep an eye on them. They do not, in my experience in this area, they don't dispense medication. They usually have meals, they have activities and things like that. They kind of keep an eye out and they will call you if something's going on. But that might be 24 hours, might be 36. You never know. You can usually have somebody clean it, that kind of thing. Like, they'll have that kind of stuff there. You have to pay for it. But that's about it. For many people, that's perfect. The next level is assisted, and there's a lot of kind of misconceptions, I think, and I had misconceptions about what assisted living was when I was first kind of navigating this process. I thought of assisted living as your traditional cinder block walls, bunk style, dormitory like nursing home. And it's not in most cases. And I've visited several when my parents were going through this process, and they're actually really nice. And so, what is assisted living? Assisted living means that they will come and dispense medication. They will take vitals. They will check on your person. They also can think about, hey, Jim, I think that your mom's coming back from this illness. She probably needs to up her level of care, which is part of, usually, in at least the system that I work with. They can come in and help the person bathe. They can do more intensive cleaning. They can do their laundry for them. All of this stuff costs money. Here's a critical point, and as an aside, and relates back to that power of attorney for finance and healthcare. One would suspect that insurance would pay for the cost of assisted living or independent living or skill care or memory care. It does not. If you had long-term care insurance, not many people do. My parents did not. That might help with it a little bit. Normal insurance, Medicare, does not pay for that at all. It's honestly, and this is just a brief aside, in a country where we presume to protect the most vulnerable, allowing a system that costs that much every month for people who cannot take care of themselves is, to me, kind of a crime. It's not cheap. Living in an independent living place in my community where I live, That cost my parents something like, $3,000-ish a month. Moving that up to assisted is somewhere like $4,500 to $5,000 a month, a little bit up and down depending on level of care. Skill care is something more like $6,500 to $7,000 a month. Hospice and memory care is more like $7,500 to $8,000 a month. So you can see where this goes. It's very expensive. I know that my privilege is that my parents saved money and planned ahead for that. I'm able to pay for those things out of the trust that they have. Many people aren't in those situations, and God bless you. I have tremendous empathy for situations like that. I know there are resources and there's things like Medicaid that are available for folks that need that. Again, bewildering, absolutely, difficult things to navigate, even for someone like me who's in a pretty good position to take care of them. So back to the kind of general plan of things. Once you get past when, my mother struggled with cognitive things and stuff like that, and it was getting progressively worse, and had to move her into memory care just a few weeks ago. It wasn't a decision that I took lightly, nor was it one that I initiated with her facility. Instead, they came to me and said, it's time to start thinking about this. And this was several months ago. And I'm like, yep. And they didn't have a spot yet. And so that gave me some time to pre-plan for making that move. My mom has some dementia issues and things like that, so that required some navigation of those things. You find yourself in many of these situations being the parent to your parent, which is 15 years ago, I would have never even conceived that that could be a possible thing, or even thought about the fact that they could pass away someday. It's something to think about, and it's something to talk about. It's an uncomfortable subject for sure, but it's something to talk about that with your significant, whoever you see as that parent figure that you're working with on those issues, because having that stuff straightened up out front, like getting those powers of attorney done and stuff like that before you need it, is important, because crises occur. And for instance, and this is just one example of several crises that I've navigated with them. Talked to them about memory care. They said it's probably going to be 4 months out. I'm like, that we'll have a spot, because they didn't have an empty room at that point. I was like, okay, let's start, put me on the list, and I'll start kind of picking away at some of the things that need to be done, like sorting through, okay, so she's going from a 2-bedroom or a 1-bedroom, living room, kitchen, bathroom, big walk-in closet kind of place, to a 1-room, 1-bedroom, no kitchen, bathroom. What's going to happen with all of her stuff? That's just one thing. And that was, in my case, fortunately, the major thing. Previous iterations of these things were dealing with a lot more than that, a lot of financial things and all kinds of stuff. But, I digress. So initially they told me this is going to be about 4 months out. Well, 2 months before that deadline-ish kind of thing, they came and said, you need to move. We have an opening, and you need to move your mother now to memory care. And that, I said, what do you mean by now? And they said, this week, no later than Friday. This was a Monday night at about 5:30. Just the limited stuff she had, we got to, okay, so how are we going to navigate that with her? Because she has dementia and she will not want to do this. And how do you work all of these things, and how do you get everything moved and all that kind of stuff? Planning that out and asking for help, that is critical. I was very fortunate in that I had some people I could rely on that could come help me with the moving part and with the sorting out and throwing stuff away part. Not everybody, there's been times in the past where I felt like I'm the sole child. It is my responsibility, and I'm not asking anybody for help because I know what's best here. In my experience, that's bad. It was unhealthy for me, and it wasn't great for them either. And so sorting through that with the help of some other people is really important, because it's really emotional stuff to deal with, and having some outside people who are at least somewhat objective to help you with some of those things during those crises is important. And that's the other backup reason for having these things kind of planned out ahead of time to some extent. Having those powers of attorney and so forth, and knowing that system and having been advocating for them, because these things happen. This decision needs to be taken today. Learning how to, get that stuff done in a quick fashion, and using your help, asking people to help you, really, really important. And in this particular case, everything went pretty well. My mom wasn't happy about the move, but it's done, and it was effectively done. I have no regrets about it. In the past, I've made some decisions under duress in those situations where you just have to make it happen. And I didn't feel and the best about some of those decisions. And I've learned to use my help, talk to people, reason things out, figure through it the best I can. In sum, if you're watching this video and you're like, wow, never thought about that, I totally feel you, because I've been there. It's a difficult thing. It's hard to navigate that healthcare system. It's hard to think about being an advocate for your parents. It's hard to deal with some of those experiences. They leave marks, for sure. Thinking about these things now and trying to sort it out a little bit, at least have some scaffold of a plan for how you might deal with something like this with your parents, is really advised. In the end, I would also say, again, this reflects my experience. Your experience may be completely different. Everybody has their own unique experiences and things. But I think that this general set of ideas of thinking about being an advocate, sorting through those powers of attorney, how to navigate the healthcare system where you are, thinking about independent, assisted, skilled care, memory care, hospice, is really important to touch on those things and work through it before you have to deal with it. As I said, with my dad, no clue, thrown into it, never expected to be there, and it was very difficult. I hope that's been helpful. I hope that you get something from this. Sure appreciate your support for the channel. Thanks.